Major Thomas Weir was a native of Carluke in Lanarkshire. I do hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, as it's how I heard Robbie Coltrane pronounce it. I think the first time he came to my attention on a Scottish TV series, but everyone else I've listened to pronounces it Carluke, including people who are definitely Scots. He was a descendant of one of the most powerful and ancient families of the county, the Wier-de Veres. He was also the son of Thomas Weir, Laird of Kirkton, and his wife, Lady Jean Somerville, who was reputed to possess clairvoyant powers. His grandfather was William Weir, or Vere of Stonebyres Castle, who married Lady Elizabeth Hamilton. Weir was a signatory to the Solemn League and Covenant and an officer in the Scottish anti-Royalist army. As a lieutenant, he served in Ulster during the Irish Rebellion of 1641 under General Montrose. In 1650, he obtained the post of commander of the Edinburgh Town Guard, acquiring the rank of major. Weir spent a lot of time abusing, hunting down and jailing Cavaliers. When the defeated Royalist General Montrose was branded a traitor, for changing sides, as indeed the Covenanters eventually sided against Cromwell with the king, he was brought to Edinburgh for execution. Weir, in his capacity as captain of the Edinburgh City Guards, oversaw the execution. A tall, stern-looking man, he was always seen carrying a black thornwood staff, carved with a satyr's head wherever he went. This was added to by his all-black clothing, a black cloak and rather gothic looks. As a preacher, Weir was infamous. He would pray in the streets in a state of religious fervour and revisit local households to minister to the people living there, often married women whose husbands were away from home, carrying his black staff that he would lean on while preaching. As a Covenanter, Thomas made a great show of piety and godliness and excelled at prayer. Weir lived with his sister Jean in a house on Westbow, a street leading down to the Grassmarket in Edinburgh. Westbow is supposed to have given J.K. Rowling the inspiration to create Diagon Alley in the Harry Potter series of books, although some claim it was in a rear courtyard accessed through a building at the top of Westbow, which belonged to David Williamson. This would now be the inner courtyard of Riddell's Court. The Westbow frontage was replaced in 1878. A fellow boarder was the fanatic Presbyterian preacher, tobacconist, John Mitchell. In 1668, Mitchell attempted to assassinate the Episcopalian Archbishop James Sharp, who he considered the Antichrist in all but name, but he failed and escaped. Later, he was recognised in 1674, by Sharp in the Edinburgh streets, imprisoned for a number of years and ultimately hanged in 1678. It's believed that rather than being destroyed as previously thought, some of the building was incorporated into the Quakers' meeting house on Victoria Terrace, with there being sightings of the ghost of Weir in the toilets of the building. The manager of which, Anthony Buxton, claimed, one of my staff some years ago had seen Weir walk through the wall. Weir's house is in our toilet, which seems appropriate. In Weir's time, this was an area noted for many Presbyterian residents. Indeed, in his capacity as a Presbyterian lay preacher and apparently pious man, he and his neighbours acquired the nickname the Bowhead Saints. It was said of him, a singularly worthy, whom God had raised up to support the cause. No gathering of the Bowhead Saints was considered complete without his presence. People would seek him out in order to have him pray with them, and reverenced him as Angelic Thomas. To outsiders it seemed that Weir had led a virtuous, unremarkable life, although there were rumours that Weir indulged in unspecified vices, but these were never enumerated and largely ignored, since he was regarded as a holy man. Indeed, there was an attempt from one woman to accuse him of immoral conduct. This resulted in her being publicly whipped after being convicted of slander. It seems as though Thomas Weir's reputation was untouchable. It was at a Presbyterian church that Weir apparently burst into confessions of witchcraft and necromancy. At the beginning of the service, Thomas stood before the congregation, as always leaning on his staff for support. He lifted his head and raised his arms. The members of the congregation couldn't help but notice the pinky hue to his skin. When Thomas opened his mouth, it was not prayers that spilled out, but a terrible confession that bound the congregation in horror. Thomas claimed responsibility for some of the evilest deeds. He pled to witchcraft, necromancy, and terrible intimate acts with beasts and his own sister. News from the congregation quickly spread across Edinburgh, despite the authorities' attempt to stop the rumours, believing Weir to be mad. Andrew Ramsay, the Lord Provost, initially found the confession implausible and took no actions. The authorities were certainly initially very reluctant to prosecute him. The Provost still wished to avoid any proceedings and brought in doctors to examine Thomas and make a statement on his mental health. Unfortunately, they concluded Major Weir suffering from nothing worse than a guilty conscience, and that he wished to be punished to the full extent of the law. However, he remained absolutely insistent that he was guilty of terrible sins, for which he was not seeking any sort of pardon, and at length he was imprisoned in the toll booth while further investigations were made. But Weir and his spinster sister Jean Weir, known to her friends as Griselle, were interrogated at the toll booth. Major Weir continued to expand his confessions, and Griselle, having seemingly entirely lost her wits, gave an even more exaggerated history of witchcraft, sorcery, and vice. She related how many years before a stranger had called a fiery coach to take her brother to Dalkeith, and how during a short trip another man had given him a supernatural intelligence of the Scots' defeat at Worcester that day. In fact, Cromwell's Commonwealth Commissioners in Scotland had been based in Dalkeith and would have been amongst the first to know the outcome of the battle, though not, of course, on the same day. Griselle maintained that Weir derived his powers from his walking stick, giving rise to later accounts that he had been seen parading down the street in front of him. She revealed that Thomas bore the mark of the beast on his body and that they frequently roamed the countryside in a fiery coach, popping down the road to Musselburgh and Dalkeith to do their devilish work. Griselle proudly showed off a mark on her forehead in the shape of a horseshoe, which she said appeared when she frowned. It was a mark given to her by the devil, she said. She confessed that much of what she and Thomas knew they had learned from their mother, who had been a witch. She went even further, saying that they were the only siblings guilty of incest, but she too had a series of bizarre bestial encounters, and had met with the Queen of the Fairy and the Devil. This Queen Mab, who under the style and title of Queen of Elphinay, figures for the first time in criminal records in the trial of Alison Pearson for witchcraft on the 15th of May 1588. Weir is said to have confirmed these allegations and added bestiality with a mare and a cow to the supposed crimes. A high-ranking public figure, Weir was not believed at first. His own confession, together with that of his sister, sealed his fate. They were initially held at the Tolbooth jail on Canongate. Giselle warned that he would certainly not to allow him near his stick, for if he chanced to get it in his hands, he would certainly drive them all out of doors, notwithstanding all the resistance they could make. He could do any wonderful thing with it, particularly that he used to lean on it in his hypocritical prayers. They were cross-examined by John Sinclair, the Minister for Ormiston, and put on trial on the 9th of April 1670. Both were found guilty at their trial and sentenced to death. While awaiting executions, they were confined in the former Lepel colony at Greenside, below Calton Hill. Most likely following retirement, Weir fell ill in 1670, and from his sick bed, rather than in the church, began to confess to a secret life of crime and vice. It would seem that he had indeed begun an incestuous relationship with Grisel since she was only 10 years of age, becoming regular when she reached 16. He had also abused his position in the Presbyterians to seduce many married women in the area, a good number of whom were named in the trial. This was confirmed by their sister Margaret, who caught them in bed on one occasion. There's limited evidence that either he or Grisel actually practised magic or necromancy. Certainly they were only charged with incest, and Weir also with adultery and bestiality. Weir was garroted and burnt at the stake at the head of Leith Walk, where Greenside Church was later built. Then his remains were gibbeted in the Galilee, on the road between Edinburgh and Heath and Leith, now a bus garage near Pilrig on Leith Walk. His last words, whilst being urged to pray for forgiveness, were reported as, "Let me alone, I will not. I have lived as a beast, and I must die as a beast." Weir's stick of thornwood, apparently taking a long time to burn and turning strangely in the fire. Shortly before his end, Weir made a further public confession of incest, and his sister, who was executed by hanging at the Grassmarket gibbet. In fact, Grisel tore off her clothes and screamed obscenities before being thrown off the gibbet, adding only to the intrigue. The remains of the Weirs were buried at the base of the gallows at Shrub Hill, as was the custom at the time. People who lived in Westbow said there'd been some strange goings on at the house. There were lights, strange noises and music in the building at odd hours in the night. The figure of a female, twice the height of a normal woman, appearing outside, laughing manically and terrifying passers-by. Torch-bearing fiends shrieking and roaring in the streets nearby. Weir's house in Westbow stood empty for over a century because of its reputation for being haunted. It was said that one of Weir's enchantments made people ascending the stair think that they were descending in the opposite direction. It was eventually bought cheaply in about 1780 by ex-soldier William Petulu, who moved in with his wife. They're said to have fled the house on the first night after experiencing a strange apparition of a calf approaching them at night, propping up its head with its forelegs on the bed end and then staring at them in bed. Due to its infamy, the top section of the Westbow was known for 2 centuries as Major Weir's land, and the same section had reputedly haunted by the ghost of Weir for 100 years. Sir Walter Scott, a great fan of all things occult, wrote in 1830, "It is certain that no story of witchcraft or necromancy, so many of which occurred near and in Edinburgh, made such lasting impression on the public as that of Major Weir." He also claimed that at the time I am writing, his last fortress of superstitious renown is in the course of being destroyed, leading to the belief that the buildings had been totally demolished. The story of Weir had been suggested as an influence on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Certainly Robert Louis Stevenson admitted to suffering from nightmares in his childhood as a result of hearing the tale. Could the stories of witchcraft and necromancy have been concocted by the Presbyterians to hide the true nature of Weir's crimes? Certainly, as a Covenanter, Weir would have been rabidly anti-papist and anti-Royalist. Serving in Ireland, he's also very likely to have committed atrocities on the Irish Catholics, including their women. For me, they seem to follow a very familiar pattern to those with strong evangelical beliefs, also strongly believing in good and evil, the devil and devil worship, and with a minority even engaging in what they believe to be devil worship. Most likely this is simply an interpretation for their actual transgressions the Major had committed. Weir almost certainly suppressed his own shadow and believed his transgressions to be located externally, and most with such views reasonably successfully suppress the desires, but those who don't can be the most transgressive.